Welcome Internet to Psychologist Casual Review, and today I'm going to be reviewing Autism and Asperger Syndrome, a book written by Myriam Noël-Winderling. So this book is interesting in many regards, as it's not going to be a listing of what is autistic, what isn't, what is Asperger's, what is classical autism, or even our ASD, as we know it now, autistic spectrum disorder. It's none of that. What she's going to talk about is the phenomenology of people with autism, and people with autism that she has met in her practice, working in therapy with. She's also going to be, because basically she's a specialist in neuropsychology, clinical psychology, and she's a linguist, so she's going to, in a way, merge all of this in a very interesting mix, which combines a bit of sociology, a bit of psychoanalysis, a bit of philosophy, and a bit of neurology. So it's an incredibly rich book, one that is not afraid to go from one field of expertise to the next. And in this book, she's going to emphasize how fundamentally in our society, autism has a very peculiar place, because it is considered, for example, in the theories, in neurological theories, as a lack of empathy, an empathy deficit theory, i.e. autistic people basically don't understand emotions because there's something lacking within their neurology. But they also are compared to savants that know everything about everything. So there's a fascination with autistic people in our society, and neurotypical people often don't really know. They're kind of stuck between fascination and rehabilitation of the autistic individual. So how she's going to talk about it is she's going to explain that in our contemporary society, the book was written in 2014, so it's relatively recent, right? We are in the society of spectacle, where we see images, we basically fed images, where TV is virtually becoming an antiquity. Now that we just get all our information off the internet. And she says that basically this creates a society where we are overwhelmed with information. And she says that in the case of autism, sometimes, and she's going to make a parallel, that we, the let's say neurotypical people, are fed information and we don't drown in it. But the autistic person is fed so much information in senses, in terms of quantity, in terms of the content, that it's all so very overwhelming. So what happens is that the autistic individual will retreat within themselves. That retreat she calls encapsulation. In French, encapsule autistique, i.e. the autistic individual is going to go back to a form of bubble or capsule within themselves. They're going to retreat from all of that flow. It's not just our society in of itself, it's also interactions, human understanding, and so on and so forth. So how the neurotypical individual is going to understand that is that there's a lack of empathy, or the autistic person does not have the codes. But what she says is that the autistic person might have the codes, but it's too much, so therefore they have to retreat. And she's also quite critical of this idea that autistic people don't have empathy, or little empathy. She challenges that by saying that recent studies, keep in mind through 2014, right, made by Markham, suggest that it's not a lack of empathy at all. It's because it's too intense. The world and the perception of the world is so intense that they have no other way of dealing with it neurologically than withdrawing, creating a barrier between them and the world, that they are basically surviving mentally by pushing this away. Which is very, very important, because in my clinical experience, it's also what I tend to think is accurate, that autistic people do know emotions. They might not want to share them, that's very true. But for example, some of the people that have guessed my emotions the best are autistic patients. So I couldn't agree anymore. And on that note of relationships, because this is also very interesting, she's going to go quite deep in it. She says that basically, because for a long time, at least in France, and I assume in Switzerland, even though I'm not quite sure, the main treatment for autistic people was psychoanalysis. And even though it was outpaced, by other fairies that came and swapped it off. What she says is that, at least in psychoanalysis, there was a study of subjectivity. There was a tentative to try and something to get to the autistic phenomenology, in which basically new approaches don't even dare to deal with. They don't really care. It's a deficit or it's overstimulation, but in both cases it gets corrected. It has to be corrected. So we're stuck in our modern paradigm with it must be changed. The autistic person has to adapt or help to adapt to our world. And for what? Because she says that our world is basically doesn't really have empathy. And that's a very interesting concept. She's going to use Delfort's concept of neg empathy. That in a way we don't care about the homeless suffering outside our homes, but we're gonna care about, I don't know, some pop star at the other side of the world suffering a breakup. That we will posture a form of empathy, but we won't really feel empathy for the people that are with us in our daily lives. We will only have a form of empathy for people that really don't habit or are in our world, in our concrete physical world. Therefore, basically, an empathy for what? For nothing, because it's a neg empathy, a negative empathy that we only feel for certain distant people, but never for people close to us. So she points out the hypocrisy of a system in which we want autistic people to feel empathy, but we ourselves, we kind of choose when we do, when we don't. That we basically know the rules, so we make them up for ourselves, but we expect them, the autistic people, to abide by the rules we make up. So she does point out that, and I really like that in the book, that form of hypocrisy. Also, very interestingly enough, for her, the issues with autism is because of that intense world theory, right, where the autistic person receives so much data that they have to withdraw to protect themselves, is that relationships are part of the most stimulating being in the world. It's like when you're with someone, you're stimulated constantly just by their gaze, just by the fact that they talk, just by the fact that they want to connect. So all of that can be so much that the autistic individual might basically break up certain aspects of the relationship. Basically, they might do fragmentation, where they might no longer look in the eyes or no longer treat certain aspects of the person. They might fragment in order to be able to deal with the person. They might also retreat or have what she calls an attentional shield. So here it's very interesting because it's going to talk about ODHD without mentioning ODHD, right? But she's talking about hyperactivity, and she says that basically autistic people are hypersensitive, quite the opposite of this idea of empathy deficit. Therefore, because they're hypersensitive, they have to put it at a distance. They have to take only bit by bit the relationship in order to process it, because they could be overwhelmed. They could feel themselves being overwhelmed. Therefore, it's step by step, moment by moment, aspect by aspect, not everything at the same time, not all in block. It's really a work of minutiae that the autistic individual is doing to be able to connect. And they do connect deeply with others. Often they don't want the small talk, all of that superficial persona aspect of relationships. What they want is the deepness of someone else, the depth. Also, what she says is that, unfortunately, because there can be alexithymia, i.e. Emotional blindness, or sometimes a lack of expression of emotional needs or manifestations, some people, more on the neurotypical side, might consider autistic people psychopathic, not in this clinical sense, right? But like they call detached, don't care. They're uncaring. And for her, this is very wrong, because the fact is that the autistic people do care, and they care a lot, but they might not show it. They might not mirror it as neurotypical would. So therefore, that lack creates a gap between both neurotypical and autistic. There's another important gap that she points out in the book, which is fundamentally the autistic individual will also learn in a different way. So she says that often autistic people have an adhesivity, meaning that they adhere to the surface of knowledge, meaning that they will accumulate a lot and they will know a lot. But often what they like, what they love, isn't is the accumulation, is the fact of knowing, of learning, but not necessarily the knowledge in of itself, which can be kind of bizarre for the neurotypical because they tend to focus on acquiring something, not just the process of learning. So therefore it can create a form of gap in which the autistic person will achieve a lot of knowledge, but will also want more or sometimes push aside the knowledge that they already have to gain new knowledge. She also says, and very interestingly enough, that apparently on a neurological level, autistic people have a more primary neurological pathways, i.e. when the baby is born, the baby, interestingly enough, has visual manifestations in their minds that kind of fade out when you grow older. And what she says is that autistic people tend to keep those neural pathways open for much longer. Therefore, autistic people, for example, have much more synesthesia. So if you don't know what synesthesia is, it's an extra perception or the association of two perceptions. For example, some people with synesthesia can hear, for example, numbers, or can see, when they see a number, they associate it with music, or some people might see spots of colored light. And all of that is non-pathological, it's neurological. But autistic people are 15 times more likely than neurotypical to have synesthesia. And her explanation for this is that autistic people keep more, how can I say, primary processes alive in their brains, literally, for longer. Therefore, they have different ways of dealing with the information on a neurological level. But on an emotional and psychoanalytic level, they also have very specific ways of dealing with the information. So they have the fragmentation of the object, i.e. of the relationship bit by bit, right? But they also have certain fears. Like she takes up this idea of Tustin, Francis Tanston, and basically that this idea that of the great fall, that the autistic person is afraid of falling, of being separated forever from the object, and therefore of, in a way, feeling deeply abandoned and rejected. Therefore, they create a whole plethora of defense mechanisms against this great fall, which may manifest by fear of falling, fear of breaking one's head. There's a whole plethora of manifestations, but this idea is that there's a fundamental terror in the relationship with the autistic person. Because what she says, and her big fairy, her personal fairy, that of Noël-Winderling, is that for autistic people, the savior is also the predator. That the one that comes and helps can also be the destroyer. And they understand that logic far too well. For her, the neurotypical don't see it like that. They, in a way, gain the capacity through interactions to blind themselves to the dangers of the world. The autistic person does not have such luxury. Therefore, every person is potentially helper and persecutor. People that can come to them, but can also destroy them. Therefore, there's this very massive ambivalence of trust or distrust, meaning that the autistic individual has to often present a false self, i.e. a version of themselves not necessarily accurate, but to avoid that predator aspect. Therefore, they're protecting themselves through their false self. Also, because of the intensity of their lived experience, they might also have a false self to try and minimize the relational aspects of it, or even how they perceive things, because it's that intense. So they have to withdraw into their capsule, right? Into their very inner world, to try and avoid that. In a way, it's similar in certain ways to Schizoid Dimensions, at least what Winderling is presenting. And here, I'm not saying that one equates to the other, right? But there are similarities, there are parallels one can make. So basically, going back to Noël-Winderling's book, fundamentally, the autistic individual has a way of dealing with things that's very different. That difference is also characterized by how they interact with people. They might adopt certain things they saw in movies, for example, certain ways of talking, certain positions, certain ways of handling one's posture. All of that they adhere to, they copy it. And in that copying, they try and use it to create a barrier between them and the others. They're also trying to adapt through that and trying to see if it works there, then it can work for me. And sometimes they might not quite land the context right or not understand everything, but this idea is very fundamental as it allows the autistic person to adapt. And for her, the whole process of fundamentally working with autistic people as a therapist is to be in touch with your autistic sides, with your autistic elements within yourself. And fundamentally, because she believes that, and I know this is kind of controversial, but that in a way the autistic experience is universal to people, but it's just we tend to forget it. We tend to create other forms of defenses when we're neurotypical. But for her, when you get in touch with your inner autistic side, then you can help them. The aim here is to use both silence and guidance. So silence so that they can feel secure to bring their experiences to the therapist, but also guidance, because the therapist needs to be able to guide them through interactions when they need it. They need to basically show the autistic person that they care, that they're there when they need it, but also not being intrusive. So it's a very interesting balance. And she basically feels also that psychoanalysis should be rehabilitated in a way, not fully, but at least in a way, because the problem is that in our modern world of cognition, neuroscience, we are denying the subjectivity of everyone by doing so. We are trying to mold the man to just a consumer or just an actor, when we're so much more. We are human, we are complex, paradoxical, we are filled with aggression, with sadness, and that's something we are losing in our world of the spectacle. We just become characters, and characters that have to act a certain way, and basically lose our complexity, which she says is a massive risk with merely having cognitive applications, and especially when it comes to autism, because the aim is not to curtail the subjectivity of autism, but on the contrary, stimulate it while helping them to navigate the world. And she ends on this very interesting note that perhaps in some ways we should consider autism not as a disorder per se, but as a personality. And she draws a parallel with schizoid at the very, very end. As we talk about schizoid personalities, we should perhaps talk about autistic personalities, which is a concept that I find brilliant, because it's something that I also at some points felt throughout my work with autistic patients, and perhaps it's something that is a personality in of itself. So I found the hypothesis really interesting. I was really happy that she wrote it down. And basically that's pretty much it. It's a great book, not necessarily an easy read per se, but really rich, really interesting. And I feel that I've only kind of scratched the surface with the contents of the books, but I really found it great. And if you're interested in autism and can read French, this is a real big recommend. So basically, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments, put them in the comment section. I'll try and answer all of them. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.